Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. First time I've actually spoken in the Answer Center. This stage is really impressive, isn't it? I've never spoken at a stage quite like this. Okay, I want to talk today about the flat earth, and I'm sure some of you would say, you're kidding, right? Well, I wish that I were kidding. Many of our critics, the atheists and such, want to equate belief in creation with belief in flat earth. I've been hearing that most of my life. And in fact, I think I addressed this question for the first time probably 20 years ago or more. I talked about the history of belief and the shape of the earth and such then. But if you would have asked me then, or even 5 years ago, if I'd be in front of a group talking about, for real, a movement of people believing the earth is flat, I would have thought you were crazy. But a little over 3 years ago, I learned that it's become quite a phenomenon, quite a movement, as it were. And there's a secular component to it, and there's a Christian component to it. And so I've been very curious about it, very interested, and I think I'm uniquely qualified to address it. So I've been doing quite a bit of research the last 3 years plus. I've gone to 2 Flat Earth International conferences so far. Yes, there are such things. And I've interacted quite a bit, read quite a bit, and I've watched far more hours of YouTube videos on this than I would care to admit to. And many people would say, well, didn't we settle this whole thing 5 centuries ago? And you'll see there a picture of Christopher Columbus, and supposedly that all settled it when he sailed in 1492. Well, actually, we didn't settle it then, because we actually settled it 25 centuries ago. That is about 2,000 years prior to Christopher Columbus. The earliest mention we have in the secular literature of the earth being a sphere goes back to the 6th century BC. A man I'm sure you've heard of, Pythagoras. He's known for his math and a few other things that he did, and music and philosophy, but he also talked about physics and astronomy a bit. Now, we don't have his direct writings. We have later reports of what he said, and we don't know for sure exactly what his reasons were for believing that the earth was a sphere and not a flat plane. This idea of the earth being a sphere has been the dominant cosmology in the West ever since, really from 25 centuries ago. And it's kind of a surprise for people to learn that, and I'll talk a little bit more about the history of that briefly later on. Now, I do want to praise the flat earthers on one thing, however. They are raising a very good epistemological study. It's the kind of question, actually, I was raising with my astronomy students 35 years ago. I would ask the question, what shape is the earth? And back then, at least, everybody said, well, it's a sphere. Okay, how do you know it's a sphere? And then I got a bunch of blank stares. Nobody could give me a good answer, which tells you a lot about the failings of our educational system. Well, I used the word epistemology there, and you may not know what that means, so I got a definition here from Merriam-Webster. It is the study or a theory of the nature and grounds of knowledge, especially with reference to its limits and validity. A bit of a mouthful. Let me try to put this in simpler parlance. Epistemology is basically how we know what we know. It's a theory of knowledge. How do you know what you know? And this is a very good exercise I'd go through with my astronomy students, because this question would come up in the history of astronomy. And I'd say, okay, you believe the earth is a sphere. Now tell me why you believe that. You see, all of our students in their educational system were being told what to believe, but not being told why to believe it. And so the flat earthers bring up a very good point here. People have been indoctrinated on this question. They've not been educated. And I took it on myself to try to educate people about this and a number of other things that we generally get wrong in our culture in astronomy. So you may wonder, how did people 2,500 years ago figure out that the earth is a sphere? I mean, today we have satellites, we can look down and see the pictures of it, but we've only had satellites for about 60 years, and I think my parents probably believed the earth was a sphere, so how did they know that? Well, one of the best things to do is to look at the Earth's shadow during a lunar eclipse. This is a series of photographs here that a good friend of mine, Jim Bonser, he comes to the Pastors Conference here every year. And back in 2015, he took these exposures of the moon during a total lunar eclipse. You've got mid-totality in the middle, on either side beginning and ending of totality, and then beyond that you have a partially eclipsed moon. Now, an eclipse of the moon occurs when the Earth passes between the moon and the sun, allowing the Earth's shadow to fall on the moon. And you'll notice that the shadow of the Earth is a circle. I put in a little dotted or dashed circle there to show you at those two different locations in the progression of this eclipse, the size and the shape of the eclipse. I've seen more than a dozen total lunar eclipses in my lifetime. I've seen several other partials, and I'm here to testify that every time it is a circle. Here's another eclipse photograph, different eclipse, different time, and again, you can see that it's got a circular shadow. Here's another one. This shows you the scale is different, and different people are taking different photographs using different cameras, different telescopes. But every time you will notice that the ratio between the size of the Earth's shadow and the size of the moon is about 3 to 1. The moon is about 2,000 miles across, and the Earth's shadow at its distance from the Earth of about 250,000 miles is about 6,000 miles. 6,000 to 2,000 is about 3 to 1. The same shape every time. I've only recently, in the last few years, gotten into astrophotography. This is a photograph of the total lunar eclipse back in January that I took. Don't you love? That's a great photo, don't you think? It was a 13-second exposure during totality. You can see a bright star off to the left. And I took some photographs before totality. Here's one. It's a little overexposed, but you can see that curvature showing up nicely. To be very certain, I took a much longer exposure, and you can see now some features in the shadowed part of the moon. But you can see in both photographs that the shadow of the Earth is a curve. It's part of a circle. You can't see the entire circle again because that circle is larger than the moon is. Now, I took one of these photographs from before the eclipse and one from after the eclipse. These are both mine. The others I showed you are not my photographs. But again, this is just from January. And again, I can put in this little Mickey Mouse head with ears to show you what the shape and size of the Earth's shadow is. And eclipse after eclipse after eclipse, we see the same thing. Now, could a round, flat Earth like a pizza pan produce a round shadow? Well, yeah, it could if the sun is coming directly down like this, or if the light's coming up like that. But that would only work at midnight. If you had a flat Earth sitting here, round flat Earth, and the sun's over here, and the moon's over there, is the Earth going to cast a round shadow on the moon? And the answer is no, it's not going to. But no matter what time of night or day, whenever the lunar eclipse occurs, dawn to sunset, sunset to sunrise, you always see a circular shadow. And the only shape that consistently casts a circular shadow is, regardless of orientation, is a sphere. And that argument was used by Aristotle. You all heard of Aristotle, right? He was the most learned man in the ancient world, believed to be at least. And around 350 BC, that's nearly 2,400 years ago, he wrote a book called On the Heavens. And in that book, he gave several reasons why the Earth was a sphere. And one of them was the shape of the Earth's shadow during an eclipse. And I start off with that one because that's one that anybody can do for themselves. You don't need special equipment. All you need is to watch a lunar eclipse of some type. And we have one of those every couple of years, typically. So you just simply have to wait till an eclipse comes along, a lunar eclipse, and watch it for yourself and see the circular shadow. But he had other reasons for believing, too, that the Earth is a sphere. He reasoned that the altitudes of stars in the southern and northern part of the sky would change. And I want to illustrate this with a photograph that, again, Jim Bonser took. Isn't that a lovely photo, folks? And what we did is we got special permission a year and a half ago, shortly after the pastors' conference. We spent about a half a night here at the Ark Encounter, and there were quite a bit of lights on, so we had to get permission for the electricians to go around and shut the lights off. Well, there's not a single switch anywhere. In fact, there aren't any switches, they're circuit panels. And it took them several hours to find that these circuit panels. We'd say, okay, you get these lights off. Yeah, and half an hour later, they'd finally get them off. Okay, what about these lights over here? And they would work on that. Finally, close to midnight, we got all the lights off that we wanted. And so near the bow of the Ark, Jim set up his camera, and he opened up the shutter, and he took a 30-minute exposure here. And you can see the stars are all going in a circular pattern. I'm going to come back to that after a while. Now, if you go to the center of that, you'll see a single star sitting there. Anybody know the name of that star? Polaris, or the North Star. Very good. I'm not surprised a lot of people didn't know that answer because it's pretty common knowledge. The North Star is in a position in space where the Earth's rotation axis is pointing almost exactly at the North Star, within a degree. So to the naked eye, it appears to remain fixed. With a telescope, you can see it goes through a little tiny circle. But all the stars go around, and the farther out you are, the bigger the circles are, and you can see they're all circles. However, what Aristotle noted was as you travel northward, that North Star gets higher in the sky. And as you travel southward, it gets lower in the sky. That's because you're moving on an arc in that north-south direction. I used to live in South Carolina much of my life, about 4 degrees farther south than here, and I can tell a difference from what the North Star is actually a bit higher here than it is back where I come from. And if you go to up into Canada, it's much higher. If you go down to South Florida, I was there a couple of months ago visiting my sister, and it was really low in the sky. Last year, I was in Edinburgh, Scotland. It's way up there, and this North Star was well over halfway up. By the way, in the opposite direction, you're losing stars as you go farther north, and you're gaining them as you go farther south. Let me illustrate how this is happening. Let this green circle represent the Earth, and let this white line represent the rotation axis. So the Earth would be spinning like this around that rotation axis. And let's put an observer right here. It could be anywhere, say in the temperate zone. It could be us, or it could be in these other places that I mentioned. Now, the Earth is only 8,000 miles across, and the stars are huge distances away. The nearest star outside the solar system is 26 trillion miles. That's even more than the national debt. Does anybody understand that number? Probably not. I don't. I pretend I do, but I really don't. We can say that they're very, 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 very far away. And from that distance, it doesn't matter where you are on the Earth, it's going to be basically in the same direction in space. So I can draw a little line here, I'll make it a little red line, orange line, indicating the direction towards that I would see that north celestial pole, or if you will, the North Star. It's close enough to that. So you'd see something like this. Now I can draw a line tangent to the surface of the Earth where I'm standing. It's actually a plane. There's a plane cutting there, and it's tangent to the surface of the Earth. And what that means is everything to the upper right of that plane, or that line as you see here, I can see. Nothing to the lower left can I see. Why can't I see them? Well, the Earth will be in the way, right? So it's going to block off everything to the lower left. And notice there's an angle between those two directions. The plane that cuts off that line, as you can see, they're cutting off where the horizon ends, the northern horizon at the top, southern horizon at the bottom, and then that red line indicating where the North Star or the North Celestial Pole would be. And that angle there is equal to your latitude. Now, it's a nice geometric proof I could go through to show you that. I don't want to take time to do that today. It's not that difficult to figure out. But let me contrast two different locations. Those two arrows would indicate locations on the Earth's equator. These two arrows would represent different locations. Would you agree they're at different latitudes on the Earth? And I'll draw a little arc and a little arc, and you can see the arc on the right is larger than the arc on the left, indicating that's a higher latitude. Maybe in Scotland, and the other one might be somewhere in the United States, southern United States even. All right, I can draw those orange-red lines in again, and I can also draw that yellow tangent line. I'm just going to do half of it this time to show you the direction of the northern horizon. And notice they're going to be in different directions now because you're on different spots. And there's going to be an angle there. And again, as I pointed out, the angle is larger if you're at a larger latitude, and the angle's smaller if you're at a lower latitude. Everybody see what I'm talking about here? And this is something that I've observed quite a bit. As I said, just in the last 6 or 8 months, I've been to South Florida, I've been to Edinburgh, and a few places in between, and this is golden. It's solid. Every time I go to these places, I can look at that angle like that. I flew to South Africa with Brian about a little over a month ago, and as I did, I was on the left side of the plane, and the flight nonstop from Atlanta to Johannesburg, it's only 14 hours going, 16 coming back. And as you're flying along, I'm looking out the window, and they had the lights turned down, and I'm looking, and I could see the North Star. And I watched it over hours. I'd look out every half an hour or so, and it got lower and lower and lower. And when I got to the tropics, guess what? I couldn't see it anymore because it was below the horizon. All right, more proof. Aristotle argued that the hulls of ships disappear first as they sail away. And I did this test myself a couple years ago. I was in Virginia Beach, It was on a cold autumn day. That's important. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. And here I used a 3.5-inch Questar telescope for people into photography. The focal length was 1,380 millimeters. That's a whale of a telephoto lens. I put my digital SLR camera on it, and I took this photo working there using the telescope as a camera lens. And you can see this cargo ship. It's got written on the side of the hull there, the NYK line. That's a very well-known Japanese shipping line. If you look very many container ships, you've seen those ships before. And I'll tell you this much, every container ship I've seen, the markings, the NYK line, it doesn't extend down to the water line. And here you can see the lower part of the letters are already obscured. Why is that? Well, this thing, I'm catching it as it's going out to sea. It's already out a few miles, and the curvature of the Earth is such, the bulge of the Earth it's beyond the curvature a bit, and I'm having my view blocked by that bulge of water between me and the ship. I'm standing a few feet, probably about 5 or 6 feet above the water level at the surface there. If you're at 6 feet up, the horizon is actually 3 miles out. So it's got to be beyond that, more than 3 miles for this to happen. Above that, you can see on the top of the hull, there's looks like a gray layer of could even be containers or not. It's actually the top of the hull, and it represents the deck there. And then above that, you've got 7 layers of containers. You can see the 7 layers, different colors. Now, here's another photograph taken when the ship was a little farther out. How can you tell? Well, the ship is smaller, isn't it? That's because it's farther away. And as you look at there, can you see any of the hull? None of it. The lettering is gone, the hull is gone. You can see a very slight, what we call an inferior mirage, the kind of mirage you see on the highway in summer days. And you're seeing reflected there the bottom layer of containers and that gray layer I told you about, but none of the hull is visible. And then a little farther out, the ship is turned. It's got its stern to us now. And you're seeing now, actually, most of those containers you're seeing are reflections of that internal inferior mirage. And you're seeing only about half of the containers. And you're seeing the back of the bridge castle, that white thing you see in the first 2 photographs, that's the bridge castle you're now seeing there. And my last photo here is all you're seeing now is the bridge castle, and it's mirrored by that inferior mirage. You're seeing none of the hull, and you're seeing none of the containers. This is pretty clear evidence, folks, that as the ship sails away, the bottom of it disappears first. Flat earthers I've talked to, they demand, show us the curve, show us the curve. I show them the curve, and what can you say? Well, that most of them just kind of ignore it. It's amazing how that works. The ancient world, not only did they know the shape of the Earth, but they knew the size. A guy named Eratosthenes measured the Earth's circumference pretty accurately around 200 BC. 200, that's 2,200 years ago. Not only did they know the shape of the Earth, they knew how big it was pretty accurately. How did he do that? Well, he lived in Alexandria. This is a Greek city of learning, very cosmopolitan city in North Africa, in northern Egypt. And he traveled to southern Egypt near modern-day Aswan. Back then, the city was called Syene. And he noticed on the summer solstice, June solstice, he goes there and he looks down into a very deep well. And right at noon on the summer solstice, he could see the bottom of the well. Sunlight was coming straight down because the sun was directly overhead at that location, only for a moment and only at the time of the June solstice. No other time could you do that. Typically, when you look into a deep hole like that, the sunlight's coming in at an angle and the bottom is not illuminated. So you can't see the bottom of most wells. So he goes back up to Alexandria, and he knew at Alexandria you could never see the bottom of a well because the sun was never directly overhead. So the following year, not the same year, but a following year, it took a while to travel between the points, as you might imagine, he erects a vertical pole, we call it a gnomon, and he knew when the June solstice was, and he knew when noon occurred, and so he watched for the shadow cast by this gnomon. Here's the gnomon sitting here. It cast a shadow over here, and you get this angle right there. And that angle turns out to be about 7 degrees, or 1/50th of the Earth's, of a complete circle. If you divide 7 into 360, you get about 50, don't you? So it's 1/50th of the Earth's circumference there. Well, it's a simple matter of geometry. All you have to do is find out what the difference in latitude, difference in distance is between those two. And there's something about Eratosthenes I haven't told you. Eratosthenes is credited with, he's called the father of geography. He coined the term, and he was crazy about geography. If you wanted someone to blame for geography because you didn't like that in school, Eratosthenes is your man, all right? So he had all this surveying done, and he knew the distance between those two cities pretty accurately. All he had to do was multiply that distance by 50, and he had the circumference of the earth, divide it by 2 pi, and you have the radius. He expressed it in a unit called the stadium. If he used a more common stadium that we think was used at the time, his answer is within about 20% of the correct answer. If he used a less commonly used one, his answer was within 0.5% of the correct answer. Either way, that's an impressive result. So again, in the ancient world, they not only knew the shape, but also the size of the earth. So if this has been the standard cosmology throughout history, at least since the ancient times, again, Aristotle was very well revered from his own day forward. His teachings were carried over the known world then by his star pupil, Alexander the Great. And so his ideas were promulgated everywhere. And very quickly, people in what we know the Western world and even the Middle Eastern world knew the earth was a sphere. So if that is the case, how did this whole myth, and I do call it a myth, of the flat earth arise? Well, it came about in the 19th century. A lot of goofy things came about in the 19th century. I think it's because it's bearing fruit finally of what some people call, I think they miscall the Enlightenment. I've always thought that the Enlightenment was probably one of the greatest disasters to befall man. And if you're a pastor, anybody pastors here? You like 3-point outlines? I can give you a 3-point outline on with alliteration on where the 3 greatest disasters in history. Number 1, the fall. Number 2, the flood. And knowing where the Enlightenment came from, France. Okay, so you got 3 F's on that one. So you get fruition, and I hope there aren't any French people here today. I'm sorry if there are. All right, the 19th century was a fruition of a lot of these things. And one of the developments that came along was what we call archaeology. People kind of worked at archaeology a bit, but it didn't become a science really until the 19th century. And there was a lot of excavation in Mesopotamia. And they found this depiction of a cosmology there of a round, flat earth with a hard dome over top. And immediately they said, aha, this is the cosmology of the ancient Near East. The cosmology. I put that in air quotes, and I put it in quotes up here because it turns out they discovered later on that it was just a cosmology of the ancient Near East. There are a bunch of others, actually. But this became the standard, the only one, supposedly, which is not true. Now, the second thing coming along about the same time is what we call the documentary hypothesis. This is this theory that Moses did not write the Pentateuch. It was written maybe 1,000 years later by several different groups of people. And what they did, it was done during the captivity or maybe shortly thereafter, and they took all these sources from the ancient Near East and edited it and compiled it and put it together. And so quite naturally, this then, they incorporated the ancient Near Eastern cosmology, even though there was no such thing. And so soon, among liberal theologians, these kind of diagrams begin to develop. And they said, this is the cosmology of the Old Testament. You see that flat earth down below with Sheol, the grave underneath, and the great deep, and the pillars not showing up here, but some others. This hard dome firmament on top with the stars and the sun and the moon inside. And this became the cosmology of the Bible in some places. Only among liberal theologians, as it turns out, true Christian believers, true Christian theologians at the time, thought this was poppycock, and they ignored it. It's only been in the last 25 years or so that somewhat reasonably conservative, I use the term loosely, Bible scholars have started embracing this. They're about 130 years late in coming to the party, but this is just liberalism of the 19th century rewarmed. And some of the people that are believing the flat earth will go to these sources, and recently of people resurrecting this whole thing and repackaging it for Christians today. And it's a lie, folks. It's a complete fabrication. And then you add to that a thing called the conflict thesis. This was an idea of the 19th century that there was this continual war between religion and progress and science. And when you hear religion, read that Christianity. And they set up this false dichotomy. And what they argued said, well, you Christians, you have a problem because the church taught that the world was flat long after people knew better, and it inhibited progress. If they would have embraced the spherical earth much earlier, then you would have saved yourself some embarrassment. So I'll tell you what, here you have a chance to redeem yourself, redeem the church, by getting in on the ground floor of Darwinism. If you know much about the history of the 19th century, you know that Darwinism made huge inroads among Christian community. A lot of theologians, a lot of pastors began to surrender on this and abdicate, and it's just been a mess ever since. And the thing was, this successful strategy depended upon a fabrication, because you see, folks, the church never taught that the earth was flat. That was a complete lie. It was bogus. It was created in the 19th century, and there's an evolutionary connection. Yeah, the atheists, the agnostics, and the skeptics made up this lie. Unfortunately, some Christians at the time foolishly bought into it. And one of the earliest contributions of this was Washington Irving. Don't get me wrong, I love Washington Irving. I think his writings are wonderful, but he wrote a very thick, actually multi-volume biography of Christopher Columbus in 1828, went through many different editions, and in this, he created this myth of people arguing about the earth being flat. He supposedly in Salamanca, Spain, you had, in his book, he had Christopher Columbus arguing with the learned churchman there, and the churchman saying, the Bible teaches the earth is flat, the church knows the earth is flat, therefore the earth is flat. None of this nonsense. That never happened. It was completely made up. There was discussion between Columbus and the critics, and you know what the argument was over? It wasn't over the earth's shape. Everybody knew you could sail west from Europe and get to Asia. The problem was how far it was. Why would you take off in these little tiny ships? Everybody's seen replicas of these ships? They're very, very small. You could fit the decks of all three of these ships in probably half this stage. Okay, it's very tiny. And they never sailed within no more than about 3 days of the sight of land. And he was talking about going probably 15,000 miles or more across open ocean. If you ran into trouble, there was no resupply, there was no repair. You were up a creek out there. That's to mix my metaphors a little bit. So consequently, it was a dangerous thing to do and reckless. And furthermore, he didn't know about these two big continents in the way. But the question, again, wasn't over the earth's shape, it was over its size. As further evidence of this myth, here's a nice depiction from a French Bible. So I'm going to say something nice about the French hereafter, make up for my impertinent remark a moment ago. This Bible is from around the year 1350. Notice a century and a half before Columbus. And what it is showing here is a depiction of the day 2 creation, when God makes this thing in the King James, the firmament, more modern translations, the expanse. I like to use the Hebrew word rachia there, and it has water above it. And what do you see at the middle of all this? Do you see a flat, round earth? I see a ball earth, don't you? This Bible depicts a ball earth in the Middle Ages, 1350. Now, how do we know it's from 1350? Well, this belonged to King John II. This Bible did, is illustrated, belonged to King John II of France. And in 1356, he had a disastrous defeat to the English at the Battle of Poitiers. And this Bible has been in the continual possession of the English ever since. They captured it during that battle. So we know exactly how old this thing is, and it puts to the lie that the medieval church taught that the earth was flat. They taught it was a sphere all the time. Well, I mentioned the foolish Christians of the 19th century who embraced this, and one man in particular comes to mind is a guy named Samuel Rowbottom. And he did what's called the Bedford Level experiment. The Bedford Level is a drainage canal in eastern England that is just about perfectly flat and straight. And you can stand there and look down the length of it. And what he did is he placed a telescope about 8 inches above the water. That's the reason why he did that. And then he had somebody in a small boat with a mast with a flag on it, or a big marker of some sort, only about 6 feet high though, row away from him the entire length of the Bedford Level. And he reasoned as you went another 5 miles, go out at 6 miles, 1 mile to where the Earth's curvature would block you at 8 inches, that's where the horizon would be. If you went out an additional 5 miles, the curvature of the Earth would cover up about 20 feet. And since the boat was a lot smaller than that, a lot lower than that, the boat should disappear if the Earth is indeed a sphere. Well, Rowbottom reported that he could see the boat the entire length of the Bedford Level. Now, what he didn't take into account is what's called atmospheric refraction, caused by a temperature inversions. I'm not going to spend any time talking about that today, but temperature inversions are very common in spring and summer on warm days. How many people want to go to the beach on cold autumn and winter days? Any takers? I don't see any hands. You want to go to the beach on warm, not cold, but warm spring days and summer days, right? Everybody wants to do that for obvious reasons. But when you do that, bodies of water, you may know, take a long time to heat up. And on a warm summer or autumn, summer day or spring day, the water is always colder than the air temperature. And that chills a layer of air in contact for a short few feet above the water, maybe more, and makes it cooler than the air above. Now, usually you know the temperature of the air is warmest near the ground, and as you gain in elevation, it gets cooler, doesn't it? But if you have a cold body of water, the air in contact with the water and a little above that will be colder than the air above, and then above that, the air will diminish in temperature. Because of the speed of light being different at different temperatures, when you have a temperature inversion, the light can actually bend along the edge of the Earth. Now, remember when I did my experiment at Virginia Beach, I did it on a cold November day. The air temperature was 49 and 50 degrees. The water temperature was 62 degrees. There was no temperature inversion. Was it fun being at the beach that day? No, it's always windy at the beach, and it was raw that day. But if you do your due diligence, you will find indeed that ships' hulls will disappear first. Now, there's a famous modern example of this, a guy named Joshua Nowicki, a very good photographer, and by the way, not a flat earther. Repeat, not a flat earther. He has taken photographs of the Chicago skyline from across Lake Michigan at various places, state parks, at a distance of more than 50 miles. And if you do the calculation, the curvature of the Earth should block out nearly 2,000 feet, which is higher than anything on the Chicago skyline. So none of the Chicago skyline should be visible. But if you look carefully, if you know Chicago at all, you can see the Willis Tower, you can see the Hancock Building, you can see the Standard Oil Building, and a few other things perhaps. So they say, aha, this is Exhibit A. However, Nowicki and others have taken photographs many different times, and they don't always show it like this. They show more and less. Sometimes it's just the tops of about those 3 tallest buildings. And even Nowicki has put together a time-lapse video taken over a couple hours, and in that, the skyline bobs up and down. Now, most people see this one photograph and they say, aha, if the Earth is flat, that's what you would see, but if the Earth is curved, you shouldn't see anything, so therefore the Earth must be flat. But how do you explain the fact that it bobs up and down, and sometimes you don't see it at all, particularly on very cold winter and autumn days when people generally are not paying attention? And again, contrast with my earlier photos. So can you sometimes see things beyond the Earth's curvature? Yes. It's what we call a superior mirage. Flat earthers confuse that with inferior mirages all the time. Very different thing going on here. And they use this as Exhibit A, but they don't show you photographs like mine, because it contradicts completely what they have to say. So the flat earth movement was born in the 19th century. He gained a lot of adherents. Apparently, Rowbottom was quite an arguer, and when he would get people flustered, and I've often wondered if Rowbottom was not for real. He just may have been one of those devilish people who just like to argue. Have you known people like that? They would take something they know to be wrong and absurd, but they want to argue it just to fluster you. And I suspect, I don't have proof of this, but I suspect Rowbottom was doing that. And so he convinced all these people, and he must have been having a lot of fun at their expense, and they had no idea he was playing them for fools. The movement kind of peaked around 1900 and then began to slowly ebb. And by the 1930s and 40s, there was hardly anybody that believed in flat Earth. In the 1950s, there was a Flat Earth Society that came about, and there have actually been several Flat Earth Societies. They go for a while, they die, they start up again, they die. And the modern Flat Earthers think that they're shills for the establishment. It's funny that they disregard them. So it turns out many of those Flat Earth Societies have been pranks or been kind of tongue-in-cheek. Many times the membership has been dominated by people who don't believe the Earth is flat. They join as a joke. But then, about 5 years ago, this thing erupted once again, largely through social media, YouTube videos, and the like. and it's just spread through the internet like crazy. I've been saying for years, the internet will be the death of us yet. And all sorts of things, crazy ideas can be promulgated on the internet, alongside with some good ones too. You simply have to have some discernment. But I'm amazed at how little discernment many people have. And I've encountered a broad range of theological beliefs. Some of them are Christian, some are not. They like to say that there are no atheists among the flat earthers because their cosmology would be so contrived it couldn't happen naturally. But on the other hand, it doesn't bring into biblical Christianity, does it? For instance, there are New Agers who are flat earthers. There are Muslims who are flat earthers. So it's a broad theological range, and they are very divided. I've seen a lot of squabbling going on between them over this. Now, I want to spend at least a few minutes here talking about the supposed biblical arguments. I can't do them all today. I don't have time. I'm discussing that elsewhere in print. But one common theme I've seen is that many of the Christians who want to argue the earth is flat, they start off by saying that, well, I believe the Bible is literally true. And they say, you creationists, you claim to believe the Bible is literally true. You people that answers in Genesis, you claim to believe the Bible is literally true, but you obviously don't. Well, they're right. Is everything in the Bible literally true? Is everything in the Bible literal? I'll put it that way. Is everything in the Bible literal? And the obvious answer is no. We get accused of that all the time. For instance, there are figures of speech in the Bible. There are idioms that are used in the Bible. There are similes. Jesus used a lot of similes. His discussion of the kingdom of heaven is like this. He didn't say the kingdom of heaven is this. It's not like leaven in a loaf, something like this. It's not a pearl of great price. It's not a treasure hidden in the field. It's like that in some respect. But he also used metaphors, and similes and metaphors are found in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. Jesus said that he was the door. He said he was the vine and his disciples were the branches. Were they literally that? He also said that he was the bread of life. He was the living water. When he talked to the woman at the well, obviously from her reaction at first, she thought he was talking about literal water because he said, sir, give me some of this water because this well is deep and far from town, and I'd sure like not to come out here all the time and try to get some water out of this well. She didn't get it. Of course, he wasn't talking about literal water, is he? So consequently, there are many, many things in the Bible that are not literal. And this is particularly true in the poetic books and the prophetic books. They have a lot of symbolism and allegorical themes found there. And I find it interesting that many, many of the scriptures they try to claim proves a flat earth are coming out of the prophetic and poetic books. And they like to rip them out of context many times. And I've had arguments with these people, and they just are fierce about it. They just will not see the light on these things. Now, these things of symbolism and allegorical things and simile and metaphor are largely absent from the historical narrative. You see, the danger people have, the fear that they have, they say, well, if I admit that anything in the Bible is not literal, then everything is open for discussion. No, that's not the way it works. Genesis has some few idioms and figures of speech and so forth, but its historical narrative, it's pretty clear from the genre there, and there's no evidence that there's any kind of symbolism or allegory coming here. When it says that God created the world in 6 days, it's pretty clear it means 6 days. That's what it's talking about there. So let's look at a few of these. One they like to talk about is Isaiah 40:22, and probably many of you know this. It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and I've underlined that, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. And they say, see, circle of the earth. Circle can only be two-dimensional. It can be round, it can't be any other shape. Well, actually, a sphere is a three-dimensional circle, okay? In some sense, a sphere actually is circular. And when they start insisting that a circle can only be two-dimensional, they really are demanding things that are not supported by the language. And also, the original Hebrew word is a bit ambiguous. Some people say it refers to the spherical earth. Other people say, no, it has to only be equal to a two-dimensional earth. I've looked at it, talked to Hebraists about it, and I come away saying it's a bit ambiguous. You could read it either way. But to say that it has to be one or the other, I think is over-reading what actually is there. But nevertheless, they're undeterred. This is the model that many of them want to have, based on Isaiah 40:22, that the earth was a round, flat disk. Okay, but Doesn't the earth have four corners? Isaiah 11:12, for instance, says, he raises a signal for the nations and will assemble the banished of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Or how about this? Revelation 7:1. After this, I saw four angels standing at the four corners of the earth, holding back the four winds of the earth, that no wind might blow on earth or sea or against any tree. Well, which is it? Is it round or is it square? Well, one flat earther in the 1890s just split the difference. Orlando Ferguson created this square and stationary round earth. And he has like 500 verses there supposedly supporting the idea that the earth is flat. What about ends of the earth? They say certainly, and it's used 28 times in the Bible, you can't have an end to the earth, an edge to the earth, if the earth is spherical, but you can if it's round and flat, can't you? Okay, well, let's look at a couple of these. I'm not going to be exhaustive here. I'm just looking at a couple of them. One is Psalm 67:7, and it says there, God shall bless us, let all the ends of the earth fear him. Now, they want to take this very literally. They say, okay, it says ends of the earth, so therefore the earth must have some ends to it, an edge, and you can't get that on a spherical earth. Well, let's keep reading in this. What does it say? The second phrase in this one verse says, let all those ends of the earth fear him. Apparently, they believe that geography can fear the Lord. Can geography fear the Lord? No, only people can. So when it says ends of the earth, it must be talking about people. It's not talking about some physical edge to the earth. And this idiomatic expression, and we still use this idiomatic expression in English today, probably came from the Old Testament, I'm going to guess. When you say the ends of the earth, you're not talking about a physical edge, you're talking about being at the remotest part of the inhabitable earth. Or try this, Isaiah 45:22. Turn to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God and there is no other. Apparently, if this is literally the edge of the earth, you're saying that real estate can be born again, can find salvation. Well, clearly that's not the case. It's talking about people once again. You know, the flat earthers are masters of taking one little phrase like ends of the earth, 4 words, and saying, aha, let's look at that and nothing else, forget everything before and after that, look at those 4 words. Well, that's not the proper way to look at Scripture. It's not rightly dividing the Scriptures, now is it? As Paul wrote to Timothy. You have to look at the entire verse, you have to look at the context, you have to look at a lot of things. Clearly, ends of the earth is not talking about a physical edge, yet this is some of the hundreds of verses they claim supports the earth being flat. I love this one, the tree of Daniel 4. They like to quote Daniel 4:11. It says, the tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. And they're saying, look, if you got this really tall tree, you know, if you say here in North America, people in Australia can't see it. People in South Africa can't see it if the earth is a sphere. But if it's a flat earth, they could see it from all over. Therefore, this is teaching that the earth is flat. Okay, let's look at the rest of the chapter because it's a whole story in one account in one chapter. And it tells us very clearly in verse 10, this is Nebuchadnezzar speaking here, the visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw and behold a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. Nebuchadnezzar is having a dream. Folks, this is not a real tree. It's a dream. And if that's gonna miss you here. Actually, it's mentioned several times, about 10 times in this whole chapter 4 of Daniel. It's a dream. It's a vision. It's not a real tree. And who is dreaming the dream? It is a pagan king, Nebuchadnezzar. Some people think he eventually found salvation, but at the time, I don't think he was. He was still a pagan king at that point. And later on in the interpretation, Daniel interprets this dream. Again, did I mention it's a dream and it's not real? It's not a real tree? Daniel then says, well, this non-real tree in this dream represents Nebuchadnezzar. So you've got a non-real thing representing something else. Now, there is something literal here. The dream literally was fulfilled. It really was fulfilled, literally. That's the literal part of this whole chapter. And by the way, he really did have a dream. That's literal too. And he asked people to interpret the dream, and none of them could. That's literally true. And Daniel was able to interpret it. That's literally true. He gave them the meaning. That's literally true. And the fulfillment is literally true. But the dream itself is not a literal thing. It's a dream, folks. And they try to tell us that this is teaching the cosmology of the Bible. No, it's at best, it might reflect the cosmology of Nebuchadnezzar, but we don't even know that. They're reading an awful lot into this one verse, aren't they? And again, they like to take these things out of context. Well, the flat earth model today, and I've had difficulty getting these people nailed down. I try to interview flat earthers when I can, when they'll talk to me, and I ask them questions about specifics, and it's like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. It's very difficult. They're very non-committal about a lot of things. They really don't know much of what they do know, but they know what they don't know. That's really kind of weird. And this is basically what you get from most of them. The Earth is round and flat. You can see there in the middle, there is and the North Pole near the middle. The United States is over in North America is on the far side. Africa is to the lower left. Asia and Europe kind of in the middle. And Australia, look how big it is. It has to be on this depiction off to the far right. You see what I'm talking about here? And then there's a dome over top, the firmament. That's what God made on day 2. And the stars are affixed to that. And then either the sun and the moon are inside of that firmament as well, or they're just below it a little bit, all right? That's the current model that they have. Now, one of the most obvious things you may ask yourself, well, wait a minute, how do you get day and night? If the sun and the moon, if the sun's always above the Earth, then you can see the sun from anywhere on Earth. For instance, over here, you can draw a line from Africa to the sun there on the left, and you can draw one from North America over to the sun, and one from North Pole, and one from Australia. Everybody should be seeing the sun at the same time. You see the problem there? Well, they have a ready answer for that. They argue that the sun is not just a big ball of light, it's like a spotlight. It's got a spotlight, so it shines down. You've got a little cone shining, it's a yellow cone shining down on the Earth, and it goes around in a big circle. That dotted line circle shows you that. It's going around the axis of the North Pole. And in fact, this little illustration shows you what it looks like. That little yellow ball going around and around is that sunlight shining down, and it's shining only part of the world at a time, and the moon is that other little white thing moving around. And that's how they want to prove this to you. All right, where do you begin with something like this? Well, for one thing, notice that if the sun is only a few thousand miles above the Earth, and they all believe that apparently, then won't the sun's distance change throughout the day? At midday, it'll be high overhead, it'll be closest to you, but at other times of the day, it will be farther away. And so when things are closer to you, don't they look bigger than when they're far away? They look smaller. So I tested this back a couple of years ago. What I did is I started off with the claim, and Robotham and others from 100 years ago plus said the sun was 32 miles across and 3,000 miles high. Now, in their model, the sun doesn't actually rise or set. It just goes in circles. And they say setting and rising is just a matter of perspective, which really doesn't work. So I tested this a couple of years ago. I took photographs of the sun using the Questar telescope again, one early in the morning, when the sun was only 8 degrees high in the sky, around 7:30 Eastern Daylight Time on this date in August in 2016. I did it also at 1:45 p.m., which was Eastern Daylight Time, which is local noon, when the sun was 63 degrees up. And I calculated that the sun would appear 6.4 times larger at the later photograph than in the earlier photograph. As it turns out, the actual dimensions don't matter. If you change the height of the sun, it all cancels out in the calculation, as it turns out. You can't deny the geometry, I don't think. So here's my first photograph I took. The sun's kind of orange and kind of faint, and you can see a tree limb there in the lower right of the sun. And so the sun should be 6.4 times larger later on. There it is it? No, and by the way, I kept the same camera settings on these. Same ISO, same exposure time, nothing. The change in color and brightness is due to refraction, or actually scattering in the Earth's atmosphere, we call extinction. Now, they make a number of false claims. One of them is that the North Star is visible well into the southern hemisphere. I've already tested that. I watched in the plane a month ago, and it disappeared by the time we got to the southern hemisphere. And I've been to the southern hemisphere 11 times, and you cannot see the North Star from there. I know the sky very well. I looked. You can't see it. They also claim that the circular pattern of stars throughout the night can happen only on a flat Earth. Remember that diagram figure I showed you Jim took around the arc? Well, take a look at this. They say that the North Star should be visible. You see that red line I drew? I drew from the top of the dome. That's where the North Star is. It's directly over the North Pole in their model. And so I can draw a line from there to Australia, and you should be able to see it. I've been to Australia. You cannot see the North Star from there. It's a false claim they make, and I don't know what to say when I see just false claims being repeated by these people. And there's a little diagram I could take the time, I'm not going to show you why that's not the case. Let's just jump onto this. There's our domed world, and notice that what they have every day is the firmament, which is resting on the ice wall they call Antarctica. There is no Antarctica, there is no South Pole. There is an ice wall that keeps all the oceans in, doesn't drain off the side of the Earth. That's very convenient. And the dome rests on that, and the dome spins around once a day, carrying the stars with it. And they say that you get a circular pattern only on a flat Earth. Well, if you're along that red vertical line there, on the Earth, that would be the North Pole, you would look up and you'd see that circle as a circle. But what if you're off of that line, say over in Australia or in Africa or North America? You're not going to see it as a circle. And I had some people recently make this big circle for me to illustrate what I'm talking about. These stars are going to go in a circle like this around the North Pole, North Celestial Pole, around the North Star, as you will. People down the middle, does it look like a circle? It should. But what happens if you view it off axis? We call that an ellipse. And people on the side, you're already seeing an ellipse. In other words, the only place on the Earth, on a flat Earth with a dome over top that's spinning, the only place on the Earth that the stars will go in a circle is at the North Pole of the Earth. None of us live there. I've never been there. I simulated this in the planetarium at the Creation Museum. I set it up so the stars were spinning around the top of the dome. I set my camera off to the side and took a picture, and you have 30-second exposure, and you can see that the stars are not going in circles, are they? They're going in ellipses. I took this photograph a year and a half ago in Arizona. Are they ellipses or are they circles? Clearly a circle. Circles in each one of them. I took this is the time-lapse video I did just a few weeks ago from my house. The North Star is right here, or the peak of my house. Here is the Big Dipper. Do you all see what I'm talking about? I have 118 exposures over a little bit over an hour. Watch what happens over that little over an hour. They all seem to spin around a spot just next to the North Star, don't they? And they're going to go in circles. But what happens if you go to the southern hemisphere? Well, I'm glad you asked. I took this when I was down in South Africa last month. You can see the Milky Way to the left. You can see a couple of small satellite galaxies to the right of center called the Large and Small Magellanic Clouds. The Southern Cross is to the left. None of these stars can you see really from here in northern Kentucky. And if I do an exposure here, this is an hour and a half, 190 exposures, time lapse. You notice they're spinning around one spot. There is no South Star. What do you notice that's different from the other one? It's going clockwise. The other one was counterclockwise, right? That's because you're looking the other direction. You see, in the real sky, there are two different places the stars are spinning around. One is above the Earth, one's below the Earth, meaning the Earth is a sphere. But in the flat Earth model, there's only a dome. There's only one spot that it goes around. And from south of the equator, you can't see that spot. You've got a totally different spot in the southern hemisphere that you can't see from the northern. Again, this is obviously very wrong in the flat Earth model. Okay, how do they explain lunar eclipses? Well, they try to point out what the selenelions, these are places where you can see the sun and the moon simultaneously. When I first encountered this about 3 years ago, I thought, what? It's almost like the sun's way up here and the moon is way up here. No, what happens is every lunar eclipse, there's a thin strip where the sun is setting and the moon is rising, where the eclipse is beginning, and the sun is on the western horizon and the moon is on the eastern horizon. And because you see the sun and the moon are not point masses, neither is the Earth's shadow. The sun and the moon are like a half degree across, and the Earth's shadow is like 1.3 or 1.5 degrees across. Plus, atmospheric refraction will lift them up a little bit. So it is possible, if you're in the right spot, you have good exposure west and east, no clouds, you can actually see the sun and the moon briefly if an eclipse is starting at sunset. But the sun quickly sets and the moon gets higher and you don't see the sun anymore. Or you can see it at sunrise where the eclipse is ending. It's a little thin strip on either side of the Earth. Nothing wrong here. It doesn't disprove the conventional understanding at all. They don't understand what they're talking about here. And notice that they don't offer a positive explanation. When I've talked to flat earthers about this and asked them, they're adamant. They know what doesn't cause eclipses, but they have no curiosity as to what actually causes them. They know what doesn't cause them, but they don't know what does cause them, and they don't care. It's the funniest way of looking at the world. How do they explain solar eclipses? They don't. Again, they also assert that the conventional understanding is somehow wrong. They try to argue that the moon is a transparent disk, that you can see stars shining through it. And as an astronomer who's been looking at the sky for over a half century, that's total nonsense. I know better than that. These are people who don't know any more about astronomy than what they've seen on YouTube videos. Some flat earther claims it, so it must be true. Now, so they claim to see stars shining through. This is an example of an occultation of a bright star, Aldebaran. I took this with just my camera on a tripod a few years ago, and I'm sorry I couldn't do it any better than this, but can you see the star to the upper left of the moon? Now, only half the moon is lit. You can see the unlit portion, and this is about 10 minutes out. And about 10, 15 minutes later, I took another photograph, and the star's not there, is it? That's because the moon passed in front of it. And if you looked at it through the telescope, you wouldn't see anything shining through. Clearly, the moon is not a transparent disk. And here is the total solar eclipse taken a year and a half ago. Anybody see this totality on August? A lot of you, wasn't it great? Marvelous thing, wasn't it? Most beautiful thing I've ever seen. My friend David Reeves took a 4-second exposure during totality. He grossly overexposed the corona, intentionally so. What do you see at the middle? I see the moon. The moon is in front of the sun. So what they're trying to say is, okay, well, the moon passes in front of the sun during a total solar eclipse, but it's something else that's actually causing the eclipse. Does that make any sense to anybody? It shouldn't, but flat earthers sincerely believe that's the case. Well, you know, if the earth is flat, then nothing can orbit the earth. So neither does the moon orbit the earth either. And there are no satellites. There are no astronauts. And we've not been to the moon. These people believe that everything NASA has done over the last 60 years is a bunch of lies. It's an organization started by Freemasons and who knows what else, and they're just lying to the world. Why, it's not entirely clear. Except that at least 2 Christians have walked on the moon. And you know, the Bible says that you can establish something on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. I have 2. Have walked on the moon. I have several others who have said they've orbited the earth. So I have at least testimony of at least 4 Christians that the earth is indeed a sphere. For instance, Charlie Duke, Apollo 16, he was from my hometown, adopted hometown in South Carolina of Lancaster. And I asked for him a few years ago to give me a couple of quotes, and he kindly consented. He said, I was a lunar module pilot on the Apollo 16 mission to the moon. We launched from Kennedy Space Center in Florida on April 16, 1972. We left Earth orbit for our 3-day trip to the moon about 3 hours later. As we maneuvered our spacecraft to dock with our lunar module, the Earth came into view about 20,000 miles away. It was an awesome sight. As you can see in the photo, the Earth, is obviously a sphere and not a flat circle. As we journeyed to the moon, we could look at it out our windows and see a smaller Earth, and each time we would see different land masses, so it was obviously rotating on its axis. Pretty clear, isn't it? Jeffrey Williams, another Christian. He's supportive of creation ministries, by the way. He's a creationist, a 6-day recent creationist, believe it or not. And he wrote this beautiful book. Anybody seen this book before, The Work of His Hands? I got a copy in my office. It's lovely. He's taken more photographs of the Earth from space than anybody, because he spent like 6 months aboard the International Space Station. Here's one of them right here. Clearly, you can see the Earth's curvature there. The Earth is a ball. Okay, what is the flat earthers' motivation? Why are they doing this? Well, some of them are undoubtedly well-intentioned. I do believe they truly believe this, but just because you're well-intentioned doesn't mean you're right. It simply means you're misguided terribly. However, I'm convinced that some of these people are doing this as a prank. I suspect that of Samuel Rowbottom originally. And others are much more malicious. I think they're attempting to make Christians look foolish and to discredit Scripture, and particularly they want to try to discredit creation ministries such as Answers in Genesis. They make this equation: belief in creation is belief in flat earth. And now they have people who are very foolishly playing right into that and wearing that badge. Thank you very much. You've been wonderful. And I'll hang around to talk to people as long as you care to, somewhere out here. But thank you very much.